The spoon shook faintly in his hand, a small tremor that betrayed emotions he could not name. Unaritzia Karl Hoffman, veteran of the Afrika Korps, raised it slowly, bringing to his lips a taste he had not known for 2 years: fresh milk. Not the chalky powder dissolved in a thin water that had been his reality since 1941, but real milk, thick and sweet, alive with flavor. The creamy coating on his tongue defied everything he had been told about the supposed weakness of America. It contradicted every line of Nazi propaganda that insisted democracy bred softness and scarcity. And when he later scribbled the moment into his secret diary, hidden beneath his thin mattress, he dared to write the kind of sentence that could have brought punishment or solitary confinement had his own officers discovered it. The Americans feed their prisoners better than Germany feeds her own soldiers. The date was June 4th, 1943. The place, Mexia, Texas, where a new prisoner of war camp had been constructed just 4 miles west of town. From a mess hall windows, Hoffman could see guards, ordinary American soldiers, eating without ceremony. Their sandwiches bulged with slices of meat stacked thick, casual abundance on display in a way that was almost offensive to men who had been fighting for morsels in the desert. Hoffman thought of his own rations with the Afrika Korps: 300 grams of canned meat, 125 grams of hard bread, barely enough to sustain a man under the African sun. Now, in this place the Nazis had painted as weak, decadent, even corrupt, food appeared to exist without limit. That morning, 1,850 men, veterans of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's once feared Afrika Korps, filed into the camp's gleaming mess hall. They had expected tin bowls, thin gruel, maybe a ladle of soup from a battered field kitchen. Instead, they found a facility run with industrial precision, refrigerators humming with electricity, great steam tables, dishwashers clattering, cooks and servers moving with practiced efficiency. Every 5 barracks had their own dining hall. The men were given trays and silverware. Waiters brought food, and by all accounts, the food was good, astonishingly good for men who only weeks before had eaten sand-gritted bread in North Africa. The entire town of Mahia had gathered to see their arrival, eyes wide at the spectacle of bronzed, battle-tested enemy soldiers marching down Railroad Street. The citizens could not have known that what awaited these men was not barbed wire despair, but shock more profound than any battlefield defeat. For that breakfast, served on ordinary metal trays, became the opening blow in the systematic demolition of Nazi racial theory. American agriculture was about to wage a campaign no Wehrmacht general could have anticipated. Eggs, bacon, white bread, butter, jam, and coffee, real coffee, steaming and fragrant, were laid before the prisoners. It was not propaganda leaflets or speeches that began their transformation, but the mathematics of food, the staggering output of American farms made visible in simple portions. Every bite chipped away at illusions drilled into them for years. Their world would not crumble from artillery or bombing alone. It would dissolve meal by meal under the weight of impossible abundance. The journey to this revelation had begun weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, when Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement after the Desert Fox had been recalled to Germany, capitulated with nearly 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. This was the mighty Afrika Korps, the same army that had once driven the British back toward Cairo, the same men Montgomery himself had admitted were skilled and formidable. Yet suddenly, they were captives. Among them was Oberstfreiter Franz Müller, decorated with the Iron Cross Second Class, veteran of Poland, veteran of France, survivor of the desert campaigns. His journals, discovered decades later in the U.S. National Archives, offered historians one of the clearest portraits of what would come to be called the food shock. Müller recalled living on 750 grams of bread, 150 grams of fat, and 120 grams of sausage or tinned fish when supplies arrived. More often, he wrote, men survived on dates picked from desert palms, captured rations, or on days of emptiness. The first glimpse of a different world came in the makeshift cages at Tunis, where tens of thousands of prisoners waited for transport. The U.S. Army processed them with logistical precision, thousands each day, as though this enormous influx of captives was no more disruptive than adding names to a ledger. But it was not the speed of American paperwork that left the greatest impression. It was again the food. Feldwebel Hans Klein, a soldier from the 15th Panzer Division, later wrote to his wife from Camp McCain in Mississippi, "In the cages at Tunis while we waited for ships, the Americans gave us white bread with our meals." White bread? In Africa, we were lucky to chew on whole wheat crackers so hard they cracked teeth. And here, in captivity, we ate the bread of kings. Klein could not shake the image of American guards consuming more bread at a single meal than his entire squad might see in a week. The ships that carried them away only deepened the astonishment. The Liberty ships, great steel workhorses of American industry, were rolling off assembly lines at a rate of 3 per day. Built for cargo, they now ferried prisoners back across the Atlantic in their empty return voyages. The Germans expected filth, overcrowding, conditions no better than cattle cars. Instead, they found ships refitted for human transport, complete with lighting, ventilation, and sanitary facilities. The crossing in July 1943 became another chapter in this unfolding revelation. Gefreiter Wilhelm Becker of the 21st Panzer Division kept a diary of his meals, noting them with disbelief. On July 15th, he wrote, "Breakfast, oatmeal with sugar and milk, white bread with butter, coffee with cream." In Germany, this is for officers only. Yet here, even we prisoners receive it. The sailors themselves ate better still. The Germans watched merchant crewmen enjoy steak, eggs, vegetables, even ice cream. Ice cream. In Germany, that word belonged to the highest circles of the Nazi elite. Now Becker and his companions stood in line for food that exceeded anything their families had known in years. Lieutenant Heinrich Weber, from a family that traced its Prussian service back to Frederick the Great, described the moment in his memoirs. "As our ship neared the American coast, I saw sailors scraping entire meals into the sea. Whole plates of food discarded untouched. I thought of my men in Africa, grateful for dates and brackish water. For the first time, I understood we had not been fighting an enemy. We had been fighting an entire civilization beyond comprehension." August 2nd, 1943. The Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia. The Liberty ship gangways rattled as lines of German prisoners set foot on American soil for the first time. The Atlantic journey had already dismantled parts of their worldview, but what came next would shatter the remnants of Nazi propaganda with the force of a hammer blow. The very first meal they receive in America erased decades of indoctrination in a single sitting. In a processing hall, weary men were handed trays heavy with fried chicken, mashed potatoes laced with rich brown gravy, green beans cooked tender, golden cornbread, apple pie steaming from the oven, and coffee made sweet with real sugar. For men who had marched across the desert gnawing on dry bread crusts, this was a feast beyond imagining. Unteroffizier Johann Fischer, son of a baker from Munich, sat staring at his tray before daring to eat. Later, in his diary, he did the arithmetic. He calculated that the meat alone on that tray was more than his entire family's monthly ration back in Germany. He added, with disbelief, the Americans apologized. They said the meal was simple because we had arrived without warning. Simple. In Germany, generals would have considered this a banquet. That apology, delivered without arrogance, revealed something more devastating than abundance. The casualness of it, the sense that plenty was ordinary. For Fischer, that moment stripped away the last veil of delusion. The train ride from Norfolk to camps in Texas and Oklahoma delivered another round of cultural demolition. The prisoners boarded Pullman cars with cushioned seats, polished wood, and the rhythmic clatter of wheels on smooth track. They had expected cattle cars, darkness, and filth. Instead, they rode in comfort through a land that seemed untouched by war. From the windows, they pressed their faces to the glass, trying to reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught. America was vast, fertile, and alive with prosperity. In Virginia, they saw fields unscarred by bombs. In North Carolina, they watched families tending farms bursting with crops. In Tennessee and Arkansas, They glimpsed small towns bustling with shops and houses, without a hint of deprivation. At every station stop, the revelations multiplied. They saw American railroad workers eating thick meat sandwiches, drinking bottles of Coca-Cola, smoking freely. No one seemed to fear rationing. In Memphis, Tennessee, prisoners witnessed a dining car being provisioned. Crates of eggs, sacks of potatoes, sides of beef swung from hooks, boxes of fresh vegetables, all loaded casually for a single train. To the prisoners, it seemed as though more food was being loaded for one train journey than their divisions in Africa had seen in a month. Stabsfreiter Rudolf Richter, once an agricultural inspector in Westphalia, filled page after page in his journal. His professional, I could not ignore what he saw. The amount of food transported daily on these railways could sustain the entire German population. I saw freight cars stacked with wheat, refrigerated cars filled with meat and milk, entire trains carrying produce from farms to cities. There were no guards, no armed patrols, no secrecy. Food moved as freely as rivers flow. By the time they reached their destinations, the psychological impact was already profound. They had begun to understand that America's strength was not hidden in speeches or weapons alone. It was rooted in the endless rhythm of its agriculture. September 19th, 1943. Camp Hearne, Texas. For many prisoners, arrival at the permanent camps revealed a scale of organization and provision they had never imagined. The United States had constructed vast compounds across Texas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and elsewhere to house the influx. Each camp was its own small city, equipped with mess halls, kitchens, workshops, and barracks. At Hearne, the Germans encountered industrial food systems unlike anything they had seen. The mess halls boasted electric refrigerators that hummed constantly, automated dishwashers that could clean thousands of plates at once, steam tables keeping food hot for hours, and massive mixers kneading dough for fresh bread baked daily. To men who had cooked over oil drum fires in the desert, it seemed like another world. The Americans did not conceal their reasoning. Two goals drove this treatment. First, to ensure that captured Americans in German hands would also be treated humanely in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Second, to plant seeds for a democratic post-war Europe by showing German soldiers the advantages of a free society. Both aims required proof, and proof came on every plate. The rations themselves defied belief. They were posted openly in kitchens, written in chalk for all to see. 3/4 of a pound of meat per day, a full pound of potatoes, half a pound of vegetables, 3/4 of a pound of bread, plus milk, sugar, butter, eggs, and coffee. This was not a propaganda promise. It was delivered every day, 3 times a day. Untold Karl Hoffman himself, the man who had once trembled with a spoon of milk, was eventually assigned to kitchen duty at Camp Swift, Texas. What he discovered there haunted him for decades. On September 23rd, he recorded in his journal, "Today we threw away 300 pounds of food. Not spoiled food. Surplus. The regulations require that cooks prepare 10% more than necessary to ensure no prisoner ever goes hungry. The surplus must be discarded." The sight of edible food scraped into barrels and hauled away broke something inside him. In Germany, mothers begged for a cup of milk for their children. In Africa, men had fought over crumbs. Here, abundance was so great that waste was routine, required even by regulation. The economic logic was precise. The U.S. government managed costs by assigning prisoners to farm labor, their wages, 45 cents an hour, helping offset the expense of feeding and housing them. Yet even within that careful calculation, the daily meals remained generous. At the tea camp McCain in Mississippi, Hans Klein described the routine. Breakfast is oatmeal or cornflakes with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, coffee with cream. For lunch, always meat, beef, pork, chicken, with potatoes or rice, bread, vegetables, and dessert. For dinner, again meat with soup, vegetables, bread, and coffee. On Sundays, we eat chicken or turkey with all the traditional accompaniments. German prisoners quickly realized that their daily intake, over 3,000 calories, exceeded what German civilians were receiving back home. In 1942 and 1943, rations for civilians in the Reich had dropped to just 2,078 calories a day, and by 1944 fell further, sometimes to under 2,000. By contrast, German prisoners in American captivity were regaining weight, building muscle, and rediscovering health. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, where the highest-ranking prisoners were held, including 25 generals, conditions were even more striking. General von Arnim himself was lodged in a house, given a car and driver, and allowed his own cooks. Officers dined on steaks, roast chicken, fresh fish, and vegetables that most German civilians had not tasted since before the war began. It was not only the elite who marveled. Ordinary enlisted men were equally stunned. Franz Muller, writing from Camp Shelby, recounted one meal: fried catfish caught from Mississippi rivers, coleslaw, hush puppies, green beans, peach cobbler for dessert. And he added one note with particular force: the Negro soldiers who serve us eat the same food. In Germany, we were told America starved its Negroes. Another propaganda lie exposed. In camp after camp, at meal after meal, the foundations of Nazi belief were being dismantled, not by lectures, but by lived experience. October 1943. The harvest season in Texas. The fields stretched endlessly under the sun, seas of cotton and rows of corn that seemed to touch the horizon. It was here that many German prisoners first witnessed the true scope of America's agricultural machine. Not from behind barbed wire, but working directly within a T.B.Y. agreement under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be hired out as laborers, paid modest wages, their work easing the labor shortages caused by American men serving overseas. Thus, thousands of Afrika Korps veterans found themselves stepping from guarded trucks into cotton fields, orchards, and dairy farms across the American South and Midwest. First, they worked cautiously, expecting meager tools and hard labor under watchful eyes. Instead, they were handed equipment unlike anything they had ever used. Gasoline-powered tractors rumbled through the fields. Mechanical pickers harvested in hours what hundreds of men could barely accomplish in days. Refrigerated trucks arrived daily to collect produce. For German farmers who had labored by hand or with horse-drawn plows, the efficiency was staggering. Unteroffizier Ernst Stahl, who had grown up on a small farm near Bremen, marveled in his journal: a single American farm family produces what 10 German families cannot. Their barns are filled with machines, their fields endless, their animals fat and sleek. Even the children drink milk every day, something our villages have not known since 1939. It is not only food, it is the science of producing it without limit. The abundance followed them everywhere. In dairies, they saw milk bottled in gleaming glass, cooled by electric systems. In orchards, barrels of apples were so plentiful that many were left to rot on the ground. In cotton fields, bales were stacked higher than men. The shock was not merely the volume, but the casual attitude of the Americans who treated it all as routine. By November, many prisoners had begun to realize that Germany's defeat was not simply military, but economic. The Reich could not dream of matching this machine. For years, Nazi propaganda had proclaimed that America was a land of corruption, filled with idle workers and racial chaos. Now, those very same Germans picked fruit side by side with Mexican laborers, African-American field hands, and women working farms while their husbands fought overseas. The system did not collapse from diversity. It thrived on it. Then came December, and with it, the holiday that would pierce their hearts more than any weapon. Christmas in captivity. At Camp Swift, Texas, the prisoners gathered under pine trees cut from the surrounding woods. To their astonishment, the American guards allowed them to decorate, even providing paper, paint, and wire. They built ornaments, sang carols, and erected a wooden nativity scene. On Christmas Eve, the camp commander addressed them, wishing them peace. But it was the dinner that followed which left the deepest mark. Roast turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, corn, peas, cranberry sauce, bread still warm from ovens, and desserts that glistened with sugar and cream. Each man received a gift: fruit, cigarettes, chocolate, and even beer. Gefreiter Otto Reinhardt wrote home months later, after censorship loosened, "We prisoners ate better at Christmas than our families in Germany have since 1938. I cannot finish my plate. When the Americans brought seconds, many of us wept. I thought of my mother, standing in line for cabbage in Berlin, and I wanted to send her my tray." The symbolism was crushing. Christmas, in German tradition, had always been sacred, a moment of family and faith. To celebrate it in captivity with such abundance felt both comforting and humiliating. It revealed not only the scale of American wealth, but also its generosity. Even as enemies, the prisoners were fed as guests. The waste, however, gnawed at them still. On December 27th, Hoffman again recorded in his diary, "After Christmas dinner, barrels filled with uneaten food were wheeled away. I cannot rid myself of the image. In Germany, people starve. In America, food is treated as infinite." The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. By the end of 1943, America had produced over 55 billion pounds of meat, 2 billion bushels of grain, and more than 18 billion pounds of dairy products. The sheer arithmetic of it dwarfed the capacity of the Reich, where Allied bombing raids were already crippling transport networks and where bread lines grew longer each month. Prisoners began to realize that the very act of captivity was transforming them. They were regaining weight, their cheeks filling out, their strength returning. Franz Muller, who had arrived gaunt and sickly from the desert, wrote with awe, "My uniform grows tight at the waist. In Africa, we wasted away. Here, I gain pounds weekly. We came as prisoners, but our bodies are healed by our enemy." The Americans themselves scarcely noticed the miracle unfolding. For them, feeding prisoners was a matter of routine bureaucracy, a line item in government budgets, a byproduct of industrial plenty. But for the Germans, it was an existential revelation. They had been raised on the myth that Germany was destined to rule because it was stronger, more disciplined, more industrious. Now, in barns and mess halls across Texas, Oklahoma, and Mississippi, they learned that another nation had mastered industry on a scale their leaders had never admitted. And as 1943 turned into 1944, the question haunted them. If America could feed millions of prisoners with such ease, what else could it do? By the spring of 1944, the great paradox of captivity had become impossible for German prisoners to ignore. They were living better lives behind American barbed wire than their families were enduring in the Reich. Letters trickled through the censor's office, heavily redacted but heavy with unspoken desperation. Wives wrote of ration cards nearly empty, of children surviving on thin turnip soup, of black bread stretched with sawdust. Bombing raids had reduced supply lines to rubble. For many in Germany, 1,800 calories a day was considered fortunate. For the prisoners in America, meals exceeded 3,000 calories, rich, varied, and unrelenting. The effect was corrosive. The men compared letters with one another, measuring their meals against their family starvation. Guilt gnawed at them, yet so did disbelief. How could the Reich have lied so completely? They had been told that America was a weak, crumbling society, incapable of unity, torn apart by racial division. Yet here, even the lowest prison cook commanded resources unimaginable in the fatherland of the T. Camp Hearne. One sergeant noted in his journal, "The Negro guards eat the same rations we do. In Germany, we were told America enslaved its colored people. But they walk freely, laugh loudly, and consume beef, eggs, milk. This alone proves our leaders deceived us." Such realizations spread quietly, like cracks in ice. Daily camp life reinforced the lesson. Prisoners assigned to kitchens witnessed the endless flow of supplies. Flour delivered in 100-pound sacks, sides of beef swung from refrigerated trucks, baskets of oranges and crates of tomatoes in every season. Nothing ever seemed scarce. To men who had once counted every crumb, the sheer continuity of American supply chains was an education more powerful than any lecture. By mid-1944, rumors circulated among the prisoners that back home, German civilians were eating ersatz coffee made from acorns, sausages stretched with ground turnip, and bread darkened with whatever filler could be found. In contrast, POWs in America debated whether they preferred apple pie or chocolate cake, fried chicken or pork chops, beefsteak or turkey. Some laughed bitterly, saying they had surrendered to the wrong side of the ocean. The emotional blow deepened that summer as news reached the camps of the Allied invasion of Normandy. It was not merely the fact of invasion that stunned them, but the logistics behind it. In-camp newspapers, permitted by American authorities and often written by the prisoners themselves, they read of the mountains of supplies pouring into Europe, millions of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition. They knew now, from first-hand experience, that America could sustain such a campaign indefinitely. One prisoner, Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, summarized it with brutal clarity. Germany never lost to soldiers. We lost to factories, to fields, to a people who could produce so much that even their enemies lived in comfort. The intellectuals among them, many former university students or professionals, began organizing lectures within the camps. Topics ranged from American history to economics. They debated the reasons for America's strength. Was it geography, with its endless farmland? Was it democracy, unleashing individual initiative? Or was it simply industrial might harnessed with efficiency? The answers varied, but the conclusion was always the same. The Reich had deceived them. Even the architecture of America seemed to taunt them. When trucks transported work details through nearby towns, the prisoners saw supermarkets with windows stacked high with goods, filling stations pumping endless gasoline, diners serving ordinary Americans the same meats and pies the prisoners themselves ate. These sights cut deeper than bombs. The psychological transformation was not universal. Among die-hard Nazis, resentment hardened. Some whispered that America's wealth made it soft, decadent, vulnerable in ways Germany's hardship-forged spirit could still defeat. Yet even they could not explain the evidence of their own stomachs. When confronted with barrels of discarded bread or mountains of uneaten vegetables, ideology faltered. By autumn of 1944, the sense of inevitability had set in. The men no longer spoke of Germany's victory. Instead, they wondered only how long the Reich could endure under bombing and blockade. For many, captivity in America became not a humiliation but a reprieve, a strange exile in a land of plenty, while their families starved under Hitler's promises. Camp Clinton, Mississippi, where generals and high officers lived with privileges almost unimaginable. Even they admitted the truth privately. One American officer later recalled overhearing a German general murmur to another, "If our soldiers at the front knew how well their families could live in America, the war would end tomorrow." And so, through 1944, plate by plate, harvest by harvest, factory by factory, the myth of Nazi superiority collapsed. The Reich had built its empire on ideology and terror. America dismantled it with milk, meat, and bread. May 1945. The war was over. The Reich had collapsed in fire and ruin, its cities reduced to rubble, its people gaunt and hollow-eyed. For the German prisoners in America, news of Hitler's death and unconditional surrender arrived not with shock, but with a weary inevitability. Many had known for months that the war was lost, not from radio broadcasts or newspapers, but from the evidence of their daily lives. From the overflowing American warehouses, the endless supply of milk, the steady rhythm of trains carrying food in every season, in the camps. There was no celebration, only silence. Some men wept openly, mourning families they could not protect. Others sat for hours staring into the distance, as though trying to reconcile two realities: the Germany of scarcity and hunger, and the America of plenty where they had lived as captives. In the weeks that followed, the Americans intensified their educational programs. Lectures were given on democracy, on freedom of the press, on the rights of individuals. But many Germans later admitted that such lessons mattered less than what they had already learned through their senses, that a society built on liberty could outproduce one built on tyranny, that prosperity was not propaganda, but lived reality. The final months of captivity were marked by an almost surreal contrast. Across the ocean, their families stood in lines for a crust of bread, while in Texas or Mississippi, prisoners still received 3 full meals a day, complete with meat and dessert. Some wrote home in anguish, "Forgive me that I eat while you hunger. I am powerless to change it." Others saved scraps of bread or fruit from their rations, not to eat, but to hold in their hands as symbols of the wealth they had witnessed. Repatriation began slowly. In 1946, ships carried thousands of Germans back across the Atlantic, not to a triumphant fatherland, but to a broken landscape. Cities were ash and stone. Farms lay barren. Children wore rags, and widows begged for coal and potatoes. For many returning prisoners, the shock was overwhelming. Franz Muller, the soldier whose diaries recorded both hunger in Africa and abundance in Texas, wrote upon seeing Bremen for the first time, "We came home fatter, healthier, and stronger than when we were captured. Our families looked like ghosts. In their eyes, we saw the truth. America had not only defeated Germany, it had fed us while our own nation starved." Some former prisoners became silent witnesses, never speaking of what they had seen for fear of being branded traitors. Others told anyone who would listen, insisting that Germany must never again chase illusions of superiority, for they had lived inside the reality of America's strength. Many later admitted that their first seed of doubt about Nazism had not come from battlefield defeats, but from breakfast tables in Texas. Historians would later call it the food shock. It was not bombs or bullets that broke the myth of Nazi invincibility, but eggs, butter, bread, and milk, mundane items transformed into weapons of truth. The prisoners of war had been shown, meal by meal, that freedom and abundance could coexist, that democracy did not mean weakness, that propaganda had lied to them from the start. In the years after the war, as Germany rebuilt from ruins, countless men who had once marched under Rommel carried with them the memory of America's mess halls and farms. Some became advocates of the new democratic West Germany, citing their time in captivity as their awakening. Others simply held the memory quietly, a private knowledge that changed the way they saw the world. For Unaritzia Karl Hoffman, the man who had first trembled with a spoon of milk in 1943, the memory never faded. In old age, when asked about the moment he knew Germany would lose the war, he did not mention El Alamein or Stalingrad or the bombing of Berlin. He simply smiled faintly and said, "The day I tasted milk in Texas. That was the day I understood."